In the winter of 1856 in Jefferson County, Alabama, something happened that made ironmasters across the South reconsider the wisdom of arming enslaved workers with heavy tools. A man named Erasmus, a master whose brutality had pushed beyond what even hardened enslaved people could endure. And a single act of violence, so sudden and final that it became legend in Birmingham's foundries and forges. If stories about the breaking point matter to you, about what happens when years of abuse culminate in one explosive moment, then stay with me. Because what Erasmus did on January 14, 1856, tells you everything you need to know about rage that's been compressed for decades, and why the men who thought they controlled everything never saw the hammer coming. The year 1856 sits at the beginning of Birmingham's transformation into an industrial center. While most of Alabama remained focused on cotton plantations, Jefferson County was developing iron production. Foundries, forges, rolling mills, powered by enslaved labor, working under conditions that made fieldwork seem merciful by comparison. Erasmus was born around 1820 in Virginia. By 1856, he was 36 years old and had spent most of his life working in ironworks, first in Virginia, then sold south to Alabama's developing industrial operations. He was what ironmasters called seasoned, experienced in foundry work, capable of withstanding the brutal heat and danger, strong enough to handle the heavy labor that killed or maimed less resilient workers. Erasmus had certain physical characteristics that made him valuable for iron work. He was large, over 6 feet tall, powerfully built, with the kind of muscular development that came from years of swinging hammers and hauling iron. He could work 12-hour shifts in conditions that dropped other men from heat exhaustion. He was, in the cold economic calculation of slavery, extremely valuable property. By 1856, Erasmus had been owned by Daniel Whitmore for 8 years. Whitmore ran the Red Mountain Iron Works, a mid-sized operation employing about 30 enslaved workers, producing pig iron for sale to foundries and manufacturers across the South. Whitmore was 52 years old in 1856, a self-made man who'd started as an overseer and worked his way to ownership. He was known for being hard. He believed that ironwork required brutal discipline to maintain productivity and prevent the accidents that could destroy expensive equipment and interrupt production. His management philosophy was simple: work the men as hard as possible, punish any perceived laziness or insubordination immediately and severely, and replace workers who broke down with new purchases. It was economically rational within slavery's logic. The productivity gains from brutal driving exceeded the costs of occasionally working people to death. Erasmus had endured 8 years of this management style, 8 years of 12-hour shifts in furnace heat that reached over 2,000 degrees, 8 years of whippings for working too slowly or making mistakes, 8 years of watching other workers die from accidents, heat stroke, or simple exhaustion. By January 1856, something inside Erasmus had changed. The capacity to endure that had kept him alive for 36 years was eroding. He was reaching a point where survival stopped seeming worth the cost. The incident that led to Whitmore's death started on January 13, 1856. A worker named Isaac, about 19 years old, had been assigned to help Erasmus operate one of the forge hammers. Isaac was relatively new to ironwork, purchased by Whitmore 6 months earlier, still learning the dangerous routines of the foundry. During the afternoon shift, Isaac made a mistake, moved too slowly, positioning iron under the hammer, throwing off the rhythm of the work. It was a minor error, the kind that happens when workers are exhausted and learning complex, dangerous tasks. Whitmore saw the mistake and exploded in rage. He grabbed a length of iron rod and beat Isaac with it, not the controlled punishment of a whipping, but pure, violent fury. He struck Isaac's head, his back, his arms as the young man tried to protect himself. Erasmus watched this beating. He'd seen similar violence countless times over 8 years, had experienced it himself regularly. But something about this particular incident, maybe Isaac's youth, maybe his own exhaustion, maybe just the accumulated weight of 8 years of brutality, triggered something in Erasmus. When Whitmore finally stopped beating Isaac and walked away, Erasmus helped the young man to his feet. Isaac was bleeding from cuts on his head and arms, was having trouble standing, might have had a concussion from the blows to his head. "Can you work?" Erasmus asked. "I don't know. Everything's spinning." "You got to try. If Whitmore thinks you can't work, he'll beat you worse." Isaac tried to continue working, but kept stumbling, clearly unable to function properly. Whitmore noticed and returned, angrier than before. "You're faking," Whitmore snarled, "trying to avoid work. I'll teach you about malingering." He grabbed Isaac and dragged him toward the whipping post that stood in the foundry yard, a permanent fixture where workers were tied and beaten for infractions real or imagined. Erasmus felt something snap inside him. He'd watched this scene play out dozens of times, watched workers beaten for being injured, for being too slow, for being human beings with limits instead of machines that could run forever. He couldn't watch it again, couldn't stand by while a 19-year-old kid was beaten to death for the crime of being hurt from a previous beating. But Erasmus also knew that interfering would mean his own brutal punishment, possibly his death. Whitmore wouldn't tolerate a worker stopping him from disciplining another worker. That kind of resistance threatened the entire structure of control that made the foundry function. So Erasmus did nothing, stood there while Isaac was tied to the post, while Whitmore began whipping him, while the young man's screams echoed through the foundry. Isaac received 30 lashes. By the end, he'd lost consciousness. Whitmore had him cut down and thrown in the corner of the foundry to either recover or die. Whitmore didn't particularly care which. That night, Erasmus sat in the slave quarters thinking about what he'd witnessed. About 8 years of similar violence. About 36 years of slavery. About the fact that this would continue until he died, or until something changed. He made a decision. He couldn't live this way anymore. Either he would kill Whitmore, or Whitmore would kill him. But one way or another, the current situation would end. The next morning, January 14, 1856, Erasmus reported to the foundry for the early shift. Work began at 6 o'clock, before dawn, with enslaved workers firing the furnaces and preparing for the day's iron production. Whitmore arrived around 7 o'clock, as he usually did, to oversee operations and ensure workers were maintaining the brutal pace he demanded. Erasmus was assigned to work at the forge hammer, a massive tool used to shape heated iron, operated by swinging a large sledgehammer to strike metal positioned on an anvil. The sledgehammer weighed about 20 pounds, was 3 feet long, and in Erasmus's powerful hands was a devastating weapon. Around 8 o'clock, Whitmore came to inspect Erasmus's work. He watched for a few minutes, then began criticizing. The iron wasn't being shaped properly. Erasmus was working too slowly. The quality wasn't acceptable. This was typical. Whitmore regularly criticized workers' efforts, using complaints as pretext for punishment or simply to maintain psychological pressure. "You're getting lazy, Erasmus," Whitmore said. "Maybe you need a reminder about what happens to lazy niggers at my foundry." Erasmus didn't respond, just continued working. But his hands tightened on the sledgehammer handle. Whitmore moved closer, still criticizing. He was standing about 3 feet from Erasmus, focused on the iron being worked, not paying attention to the massive hammer in Erasmus's hands. Erasmus made his decision in a split second. After 36 years of slavery, after 8 years of Whitmore's brutality, after watching Isaac nearly killed the day before, this was the moment. Erasmus turned and swung the 20-pound sledgehammer with all his considerable strength directly at Whitmore's head. The hammer connected with Whitmore's skull with devastating force. Whitmore dropped immediately, killed instantly by the massive trauma. His skull was crushed, brain destroyed. Death was instantaneous. The other workers in the foundry froze in shock. They'd seen violence before, had experienced and witnessed endless brutality, but they'd never seen an enslaved person kill a master so suddenly and completely. Erasmus stood over Whitmore's body, the bloody hammer still in his hands, breathing heavily. He'd just killed his owner. There was no taking it back, no pretending it hadn't happened, no way this ended, except with his own death. But in that moment, Erasmus felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Satisfaction. Whitmore was dead. The man who'd tortured him and dozens of others for 8 years was gone, destroyed by the same kind of violence he'd inflicted so casually on powerless people. An overseer named Jenkins, who worked for Whitmore managing the foundry, came running when he heard the commotion. He saw Whitmore's body, saw Erasmus standing there with the hammer, understood immediately what had happened. "Put down the hammer, Erasmus," Jenkins said carefully. He was armed with a pistol but was clearly afraid to draw it. Erasmus was massive, still held a deadly weapon, and looked absolutely ready to use it again. Erasmus considered his options. He could try to kill Jenkins too, could try to kill all the white men at the foundry, could go down fighting and take as many of them with him as possible. But the other enslaved workers would suffer for his actions. Whitmore was dead. That was the goal. Adding more bodies would just bring more violence down on people who'd already suffered enough. Erasmus set down the hammer. "I'm done," he said quietly. "I ain't fighting nobody else. I did what I needed to do. Whitmore's dead. That's enough." Jenkins carefully approached and secured Erasmus. The local sheriff was summoned. Within an hour, Erasmus was in chains, being taken to the Jefferson County Jail. News of Whitmore's death spread rapidly through Birmingham's industrial community. The reaction was shock and fear. If a valuable, apparently docile worker like Erasmus could suddenly turn violent, what did that mean for the safety of ironmasters across the region? A group of foundry owners met to discuss the situation. They were particularly concerned because ironwork required arming enslaved workers with dangerous tools, hammers, chisels, heavy implements that could be weaponized. If workers started using these tools against their masters, the entire industrial system was threatened. The discussion focused on whether ironwork using enslaved labor was sustainable. Some argued for increased security, more overseers, stricter discipline. Others worried that increasing brutality would just create more people like Erasmus, who decided death was preferable to continued suffering. The trial began in February 1856. It was quick. The facts weren't in dispute. Erasmus had killed Whitmore with a hammer in front of witnesses. The only questions were whether there were any mitigating circumstances and what the punishment should be. Erasmus was assigned a lawyer, a young man named Thomas Crawford, who'd recently passed the bar and was handling the case as a public service. Crawford tried to argue temporary insanity, that years of brutal treatment had driven Erasmus to a momentary break with reality. But Erasmus undermined this defense. When asked if he regretted killing Whitmore, Erasmus responded clearly. No, he deserved it. Been deserving it for 8 years. Only regret I got is I didn't do it sooner. Might have saved some of the others he killed. You understand you'll hang for this? The prosecutor asked. I understand. But Whitmore's dead, and I'm the one who killed him. That's worth hanging for. The jury deliberated for less than 30 minutes. Guilty of murder. The judge sentenced Erasmus to death by hanging, to be carried out in March 1856. In the weeks between sentencing and execution, Erasmus became something of a legend in Birmingham's enslaved community. The man who'd killed his master with a hammer. The foundry worker who'd finally struck back against the brutal conditions that killed so many. Other enslaved workers in Birmingham's iron industry began speaking more openly about the dangers they faced, the brutality they endured. Some ironmasters, worried about sparking more violence, actually improved conditions slightly, reduced hours marginally, cut back on the most excessive whippings. It wasn't mercy, it was fear. Erasmus had shown that enslaved workers could and would fight back if pushed too far. Better to ease off slightly than to create more situations that might produce another Erasmus. The execution was scheduled for March 15th, 1856. Thousands came to watch, both white people eager to see justice done and enslaved people forced to witness as a warning. Erasmus was brought out at noon. He was 36 years old, had spent every day of his life enslaved, would die enslaved. But he walked to the gallows with his head high, showing no fear. The executioner asked if he had final words. I killed Daniel Whitmore with a sledgehammer, Erasmus said clearly. Hit him in the head with the same kind of hammer I'd been swinging for 8 years, making him rich. He died fast, faster than he deserved, faster than the men he worked to death in his foundry. I don't regret it. If I had it to do over, I'd do the same thing. Only difference is, I'd have done it 8 years ago and saved a lot of people, a lot of suffering. To the other men working iron in Birmingham, I know what you're going through. I know the heat, the danger, the beatings, the exhaustion. I know you're thinking about whether you can survive another day. Some of you are thinking about doing what I did. I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you this. Whitmore's dead. I'm dying, but he died first. That's something. That's more than most of us get, the chance to make the people who hurt us pay before we go. They're going to hang me for it. But I'm going to that rope, knowing I killed a man who deserved killing, knowing I stopped him from hurting anybody else, knowing I showed every master in Birmingham that we ain't completely powerless. The executioner placed the noose around Erasmus's neck. He stood straight, looking out at the massive crowd, his expression calm. They pulled the lever. Erasmus dropped. His neck broke cleanly. At least they gave him that mercy. The crowd's reaction was divided. White observers generally approved. Justice had been done. A dangerous worker who'd killed his master had been executed. But many enslaved people in the crowd, even while officially mourning, felt something different. Pride that someone had fought back. Grief that the cost of fighting back was always death. In the days after Erasmus's execution, Birmingham's industrial community remained on edge. Foundry owners increased security, hired more overseers, instituted stricter controls over how enslaved workers could access tools. But they also quietly improved some conditions. Work hours were reduced slightly. The most extreme forms of punishment were curtailed. Food rations were increased marginally. Nothing dramatic, just enough to reduce the pressure that might create another Erasmus. The improvement in conditions didn't last. Within a year, As memories of Erasmus's action faded, conditions gradually reverted to their previous brutality. But for a brief period, fear had accomplished what morality never could, forced ironmasters to treat enslaved workers marginally better. Erasmus's story became legend in Alabama's industrial regions. He was the crusher of Birmingham, the man who'd crushed his master's skull with a sledgehammer, who'd shown that enslaved workers weren't completely powerless, who'd made masters afraid even if only briefly. Songs emerged in the foundries and forges. Erasmus swung that hammer high, brought it down and made Whitmore die, crushed that master's evil head. Now Erasmus dead, but Whitmore's dead. The authorities tried to suppress these songs, arrested workers for singing them. But you can't arrest a song that lives in people's hearts and memories. Historians have debated Erasmus's legacy. Some argue he was simply a murderer who let rage override reason. Others argue he was resisting an oppressive system using the only means available: sudden, decisive violence. What's clear is that Erasmus's action had immediate effects. For a brief period, it made ironmasters across Birmingham and Alabama reconsider their management practices. The fear that any enslaved worker with a heavy tool might suddenly turn it into a weapon forced at least temporary improvements in conditions. The violence Erasmus committed was extreme. He crushed a man's skull with a sledgehammer. But it occurred after 8 years of watching Whitmore's violence, after seeing workers beaten, maimed, and killed with impunity, after enduring conditions that shortened lives and destroyed bodies. Was Erasmus's action justice or murder? The answer probably depends on whether you believe people have the right to violently resist their oppressors when no legal recourse exists. Erasmus believed he had that right. He exercised it with sudden, decisive force. And when caught, he stood by his action, expressed no remorse, said he'd do it again. Today, there's no marker where Red Mountain Iron Works once stood. The foundry was destroyed during the Civil War, and the land was eventually redeveloped. Nothing remains to indicate what happened there on January 14th, 1856. But Erasmus's story survives in the oral histories of Birmingham's black community, in the songs passed down through generations, in the memory of a man who struck back against brutality with devastating force. Remember this story. Remember that it happened in 1856, in Birmingham, at an iron foundry where enslaved workers faced conditions that killed them regularly through heat, exhaustion, and violence. Remember that Erasmus endured 8 years of this treatment before reaching a breaking point. Remember that he killed Whitmore with a sledgehammer after watching him nearly beat a 19-year-old to death. Remember that Erasmus showed no remorse, said Whitmore deserved it, stood on the gallows and told other enslaved workers that fighting back was possible, even if the cost was death. Remember that for a brief period after Erasmus's action, ironmasters in Birmingham improved conditions out of fear, proof that even within slavery, resistance could force change. This is part of slavery's history, not just the everyday brutality, but the moments when people fought back, when they decided that killing their oppressor was worth dying for, when they demonstrated that enslaved people weren't passive victims, but human beings who would fight when pushed too far. Erasmus, the crusher of Birmingham, the man who smashed his master's skull with a sledgehammer, the foundry worker who showed that the tools of industry could become weapons of resistance. The enslaved man who chose one moment of violent agency over continued powerless suffering. It's part of our history, violent, uncompromising, refusing to fit comfortable narratives about passive suffering or patient waiting for freedom. Remember it. All of it. What do you think about Erasmus's action? Was he justified in killing Whitmore after 8 years of brutal treatment and witnessing constant violence? Does the sudden, explosive nature of his resistance, one devastating blow rather than prolonged planning, make it more or less defensible than the calculated poisonings we've discussed in other stories? Was Erasmus's violence different because it was direct confrontation rather than hidden warfare? Does it matter that he killed quickly rather than causing prolonged suffering? How do we evaluate actions taken in the immediate aftermath of witnessing near-fatal violence against a teenager? These questions don't have comfortable answers. Erasmus committed murder with a sledgehammer in a moment of rage. But that rage was the result of 8 years of systematic brutality, of watching a system destroy people daily, of reaching a point where death seemed preferable to continued suffering. Leave your comment below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who appreciates historical narratives about resistance in its most direct, uncompromising form. At History in Chains, we believe in presenting history honestly, including the moments when resistance took the form of sudden, decisive violence. Erasmus's story forces us to confront what happens when people are pushed to absolute breaking points, when the only response that seems possible is immediate, overwhelming force. See you in the next video.